Welcome everyone to today's Praxist Table Talk. I'm Mailoria, the Media Administrator, and our discussion for today will be Praxism in relation to nationalism and irredentism. Joining us today, we have our founder, Vincent.
Hello.
And two very important members of leadership, Kennedy.
Welcome.
And Cody.
How you doing, everyone?
How are you guys doing today?
Pretty good.
All right.
No, it's fine.
So I want to begin this episode off with a challenge to the listener, because this really encompasses the topic of the discussion that we're going to have today. If you identify as a nationalist, I challenge you to define it. Are you truly a nationalist? What is the definition of nationalism to you? What are its implications? Most importantly, what is the nation of which you consider yourself a nationalist? Because a lot of times, nationalism is adopted as a vague and arbitrary ideology loosely held with other semi-related values and a reaction to the global hegemony we live under today. But it rarely has any substance on its own. So if you want to think about that just throughout the duration of this episode, I do challenge you to really look into yourself and define it as we go on. Because there's a lot of topics we're going to touch on today that might change your mind or might open the door to a higher range of values that nationalism doesn't provide on its own.
Very much agreed. And I think I'll reiterate that question at the end of the podcast for the listeners.
Okay. So I'm also going to start this off with a couple of paragraphs I've pre-selected from Julius Evola's Revolt Against the Modern World, because it kind of introduces the topic and introduces the sort of subtopics that we're going to be talking about today. So, in Revolt Against the Modern World, in the chapter Nationalism and Collectivism, he writes, "It's necessary to distinguish between nationality and nationalism. The Middle Ages knew nationalities, but not nationalisms. Nationality is a natural factor that encompasses a certain group of common elementary characteristics that are retained both in the hierarchical differentiation and in the hierarchical participation which they do not oppose. Therefore, during the Middle Ages, castes, social bodies, and orders were articulated within various nationalities, and while the types of the warrior, noble, merchant, and artisan conformed to the characteristics of this or that nation, these articulations represented at the same time wider international units. Hence the possibility for the members of the same caste who came from different nations to understand each other better than the members of different castes within the same nation." And to expand upon this a little, I would describe the Praxis understanding of proper nationhood as such. So initially, there are two factors to identity that produce a collective, and we separate them on the hierarchy of primary and secondary factors based on the importance of their different functions within the relation to a person's identity. The primary factor would be the spiritual factor, and I don't mean spiritual in like the arbitrary or ambiguous, the spirit of this nation is such and such, rhetorical use of the word, but spirituality in the true religious sense, from which all nations usually had their origin, or which served as their point of reference, or something of the sort. And then there's the secondary physical factor, or what would be the ethno-linguistic or territorial factor. And both of these factors, when either one of these are, more desirably, when both of these are combined, when they create a collective, that collective is then raised to the level of nationhood when it's integrated with the state, which is a divinely ordained institution and not necessarily a product of the nation itself. But we'll get into that later. But the reason I reference this is because that spiritual identity that plays a part in identity formulation, that sort of maintained a supremacy within the world of tradition and within the Middle Ages, like Julius Evola is referencing here, because castes were seen as part of a spiritual preordainment that needed to be fulfilled and needed a constant spontaneous fulfillment. And so that sort of took precedence over the nationality of the certain bodies within these different various groups and territories, so much so that it was able that people from the same caste were able to interact with the same caste on an international level better than they were able to interact with other people within their own nation, like he was describing here. But anyways, further on, he says, when considering the relationship between the whole and the single individual as personality, what emerges in nationalism is an opposite aspect, namely the cumulative and collectivizing element. In the context of modern nationalism, what emerges is the previously mentioned inversion. The nation, the homeland, becomes the primary element in terms of being a self-subsisting entity that requires from the individual belonging to it an unconditional dedication, as if it were a moral and not merely a natural or political entity. Even culture stops being the support for the formulation and elevation of the person and becomes essentially relevant only by virtue of its national character. This is essentially the modern interpretation of nationalism, where the nation is seen as the source of legitimacy for all of the internal and even some of the external conceptions and formulations that are more important or even above the nation on a principal hierarchy, but are not seen as such by nationalists who adopt this philosophy and use the nation as their source of legitimacy or their point of reference. But we'll get into that later. A couple more things. He writes that when nationalism speaks of tradition, it has nothing to do with what used to go by that name in ancient civilizations. It's rather a myth or a fictitious continuity based on a minimum common denominator that consists in the mere belonging to a given group. Through the conception of tradition, nationalism aims at consolidating a collective dimension by placing behind the individual the mythical, deified, and collectivized unity of all those who preceded him. In this case, Chesterton was right to call this type of tradition the democracy of the dead. Here, the dimension of transcendence, or of what is superior to history, is totally lacking. And this kind of goes back to what I mentioned earlier about the spiritual identity and the importance of spiritual supremacy over the physical factors taking precedence. This sort of relates to that by maintaining the idea that that nationalism is founded in these physical, territorial, ethno-linguistic factors, and in so being, they sort of disregard all of the transcendental, spiritual, and religious aspects that need to precede these formulations. Further on, he writes, one final consideration concerning modern nationalism. While on the one hand it corresponds to a construction and an artificial entity, on the other hand, through the power of myths and the confusing ideas that are evoked in order to hold together and galvanize a given human group, this entity remains open to influences that make it act according to the general plan of subversion. Modern nationalisms, with their intransigence, blind egoism, and crude will to power, their antagonisms, social unrest, and the wars they have generated have truly been the instruments for the completion of a destructive process, the shift from the age of the Third Estate to that of the Fourth Estate. In so doing, they've dug their own graves. Anyways, this was...
Expounding upon...
Oh, go ahead.
You're not done?
I was just going to say that this was the... this just sort of serves as an introduction to the episode and all of these various topics that we plan on covering today. Anyways, go ahead.
Yeah. I was going to say, expounding upon that, that last part especially of the transition from the Third Estate of the government or the state being governed through and for the people of whatever nation that you are categorizing yourself under. The Fourth Estate is the media and is a more recent phenomenon from the 20th century, especially in the middle of the 20th century, from post-World War II and beyond, which we're now dealing with the fallout from today. And it is that Fourth Estate manipulation of sloganeering and propaganda that kind of implants the idea of what nationalism is meant to be instead of what it actually is in reality to whatever compatriot or person or citizenry of a given nation. And that kind of hails back to what Vincent was saying earlier on Evola's writings, with the nation itself being a more subverted entity as it goes on and as it transitions away from its traditional mindsets into the contemporary age. And one sort of measure of that is looking at what the definition of nation is itself. I encourage anyone listening right now to go on Merriam-Webster or the Oxford English Dictionary and any of their online catalogs, the dictionaries and websites that they have available online, and look up those words and look at the difference in definition that they have there compared to this dictionary I have, the Thorndike Barnhart Intermediary Dictionary from 1974, where they define a nation as a people, race, or tribe, those having the same descent, and history. And we kind of see that as the physical essence of a nation, but not the whole makeup of a nation either, because there are elements at play that kind of can be subverted or manipulated to divide a country in that way.
Yeah, that kind of plays back into what I was saying about that, about those two factors of identity, that spiritual and the ethno-linguistic factor. Because you can look at, nations from history, and what really makes up their nation or their sovereignty, I would say, because I think being a nation is different from being a sovereign group. What makes up their sovereignty is really their divine ordination and ordainment by the sovereign of the king, or in various divinely ordained groups or organizations within that nation that really define certain elements and systems that work within a given nation that sort of gives that nation its character. And really, I would say that a nation is a proper nation is the expression of these various principles and traditions through the lens of a given people. And that's sort of, and I don't think that we as Praxists would say that this definition of nationhood is something to be thrown out. And even an emphasis on this group versus the out group isn't something that is entirely bad. But what we do need to take into account is that nationalism is antithetical to certain traditional values and certain divine hierarchies. And the problem of nationalism is that it really lies in the definition of nationalism, which I would define nationalism as sort of the emphasis of the nation as the origin and point of reference for all moralistic or hierarchical conceptions within that nation. And the problem with this is that it originates, especially in the modern sense, from a naturalistic perspective. And a lot of nationalists, they like to speak of absolute right and wrong and objective moralism and things like that. But as soon as any analogous themes are talked about, such as like universalism or a primordial or perennial tradition or anything of that sort, they resort back to the subjective perspective of nationalisms, which is sort of this dog-eat-dog, naturalistic, no natural order, the will of the strong type of thing. And even that in itself is not necessarily a bad thing, but it needs to be manifested in a proper state. But
it's how it's used is usually the fall of these nationalists, because the philosophy of Praxism is very much in favor of the preservation and continuations of the nations of the world and each people's right to have their own history and linguistic culture. That's just the progression of how history goes. And it's this globo homo overarching sort of liberalism that we've discussed in previous episodes that is eroding that. It's the problem when we get to the formulation of a nation as an ideological movement under nationalism that becomes kind of contradictory to its own benefit, because then you get deteriorations of that through things like racial nationalism or civic nationalism or anti-nationalism, seeing things like the progressives with their colonialist mentality of erasing a nation's history. And so you get all these negative or contradictory offshoots or repercussions from this initial movement of nationalism, and that ultimately fails the nation that they're all trying to help or destroy, and they all end up backfiring on each other. And that's kind of some of the points that we're going to discuss further.
Yeah, I want to comment real quick on that note of nationalism based perspective. And in that note, if you take colonialism, for example, when we nationalism is either you conquer people and subjugate them, racially profile them, whatever, or you either you align with them, but mostly just destroy them and conquer them. So if you move colonialism back to move back to the 11th or 10th century, and you have 10th century England conquer Africa, and they wouldn't treat the Africans as unequal colored people. They try to indoctrinate them into Christianity and stuff and see them as probably equals than their spiritual caste.
Yeah, that's really that's the problem with modern nationalism, is that when understanding the nation as the moral entity, especially when combining it with the traditional element, there's sort of a contradictory nature to that system of ideals. Because just as you were saying with if the Brits conquered Africa, yeah, you can definitely take England in the 11th century compared to England in
18th.
The 18th century. Yeah. And you would see different conceptions of what makes up their nation. You would see different principles that lie at the heart of their expansion, or their desire to keep their people alive, or something of that nature. And really, the principles that made up the English nation in the 11th century were the expressions of their traditions through the English lens, so to speak. There was the Christianity and the divine ordainment of kings and things like that, which were expressed in English fashion. Excuse me.
I do believe the Magna Carta wasn't even written yet by that time either.
Yeah. So this is a very ancient conception of Anglo-ness or whatever. But if you take England,
Anglo-Saxons.
Yeah. If you take England from this time period and then you set them on the shores of Africa, and then you take England from the 18th or 17th or 19th century and set them on the shores of Africa, what you'll get is probably two very different results, because the legitimacy of an Englishman wasn't in the scientific understanding of their biological makeup, but it was in the spiritual factor combined with the conditioning of having grown up within the borders of the English and having grown up with the customs of the English. So the elements that make up nationalism and nationalistic identities, such as race or borders, were more arbitrary. There was more of a gray area there. And I believe that this comes from a traditionalistic understanding of principle over form and other things like that. But yeah, definitely they would react completely differently, because the expansion of the English in the current time period and what actually happened in history was largely due to them seeing the Africans as biologically and scientifically inferior, and then using that to justify an assumption that they were spiritually inferior, which if you took them in the 11th century, it would sort of be the inverse effect. They would see that they were of a different tradition, and so they would try to proselytize and things like that, but it wouldn't be of the same supremacist nature, to use a lack of a better word.
And a lot of that, I think, has to do with the technological gap between the civilizations at that point. And when that period occurred, post-Renaissance of Western expansion of Europe into the rest of the world, Europe was so far technologically advanced compared to every other people on the planet that it was kind of that alien on the shores of discovery situation where nations or peoples just a few hundred miles away were vastly different in societal structure because of those differences in development by just a couple hundred years. And you look at that development on the racial aspect of things, but also in the spiritual mindset as well. Because when the first ships sailed across the ocean in the 1400s and met with the Native Americans and Native peoples there, they weren't immediately thought of as savages, and that took a couple hundred years for that label to kind of be brought upon them. They were looked more as people to be made subjects of whatever crown first discovered them and proselytized towards Christianity. But that gap in technological achievement still persisted. And then you'd have more zealotous or greedy individuals like the conquistadors from Spain coming in and wiping out entire civilizations like the Mayans, because you went to war with them, they had disease, wiped them out, a whole bunch of other different stuff that came about through the course of their interactions through those large technological gaps. And we've only seen that process worsen over the course of time with multiple industrial revolutions that have persisted to our modern age today. And that,
can I comment real quick?
sorry, just to finish, that kind of isolates that nationalism even more, ironically, because of the mass media communications across the globe with people of different races and nationalities, air quote per se, sort of having a dick measuring contest, to have no better way of phrasing it, between each other, and the constant sort of national superiority of each person's tribe. Regent?
Yeah, I wanted to clarify that even though, like, on a national and global level, we basically condemn physical boundaries and physical prejudice, on a practical and philosophical and psychological level, we can't really do much to stop the bias of the bias against people who look different, like black people, Asian people, white people, and all them.
Yeah, that's sort of like
because, yeah. I mean, you can't stop that. You can't. I mean, we want to, but in real life, people are very biased in real life, and but philosophically oppose that.
Yeah, very very tribalistic. People have like this tribalistic nature to them that very much determines how they interact with other people. So even if there were,
and that's why the oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say that lends credence to why the Praxis philosophy lends towards that historical tradition of people's self-determination of their own historical nations and their own peoples, and the natural diffusion and isolation of each peoples and their natural interaction with each other, instead of pushing everyone within the same borders and then having these conflicts come about more visibly because people of different backgrounds and traditions are living on top of each other. That obviously causes friction. But I would also want to say that probably brings in a good segue to the racial nationalists' questions and probably their criticisms of what we're proposing, as well as our pushbacks against that.
Yeah, I think that does bring in a good segue to racial nationalism, because there is an element to nationhood that is defined by the race and the ethno-linguistic makeup of the people, but that only goes so far. I think all of the physical factors that make up a nation need to be taken and understood more arbitrarily than they are by modern nationalists. Modern nationalists especially have this idea of a very rigid racial system, which I don't think accounts for the fact that most modern races are just makeups of other races that have intermingled and during the migration period and things like that. So I think that when it comes down to it, the ethno-linguistic and territorial factors of nationality, which determine the legitimacy of a lot of nationalism and nationalistic ideology, really needs to be considered through a more traditionalistic sense, and it needs to be considered as the manifestation of certain people and the collectivity of certain people within certain groups and certain areas. And that's really what racial nationalism originated as. It originated, and ethnic conflict even originated as, because, it was really by the gathering of certain people into an area for so long that they inbreeded enough and, sort of hammered out their own ethnic characteristics. And then, since they lived in that area for so long, that defined their nation, that their nation and their customs. So those were defined by, or those were sort of seen as being intermingled with the race and the traditional factor. Like those two factors were seen as being sort of intermingled. And I think to an extent they even still today are. But there's a lot of room for interpretation there, that I think that if you go with a very rigid definition of nationalism, you're going to find yourself shot in the foot, because number one, your source of legitimacy is the nation and is the biological and physical factor and not the divine factor. So you really have no claim to any tradition. But then number two, you see very rigid lines pop up. A lot of nationalists have this idea in their head of having this sort of cookie cutter, every nation to themselves, no cultural diffusion, no no natural expansion and things like that. So what comes about is a stagnation, an end of history, which is very ironic considering most of them do not want to see a sort of end of history. But it leaves no room for expansion. It leaves no room for history to actually
a little far
unfold.
ahead of ourselves.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt, because I wanted to save where you're heading more for the irredentism discussion that we'll have a little bit later.
Yeah, halfway through.
I do want to address with the audience that while we're very much against these concepts of racial superiority or exclusion or things like that, that does not mean that we are ignorant of or lend towards the progressive,
like CivNat
mentality of race, in that it is a real thing that does have legitimate consequences in reality, and it's something we can't control. But that's not to say that we hyper focus on it and make it a definitive or a sole aspect of our identities.
Yeah, definitely. Race is definitely a part of it. Is a factor of identity, and it can't really be denied. It's just, does it have supremacy over the tradition or over the divine factor?
No. And it's a tough area to navigate, because there will be a lot of the third positionists, which I do want to get into next, that hail from the school of thought from the 30s and 40s, European racial nationalists of that ilk, who get into this idea that a race is a unified people that can never disagree within each other, and that doing things for your in-group, or that you perceive to be your in-group because they hold these vain attributes about them, will always benefit everyone that holds those attributes. And we have some pushback against that, because there's this idea that if everyone just kept to themselves, like Vincent was saying, this end of history scenario where there's no natural diffusion of cultures or races interacting with each other, then everyone will just get along just fine. And we know that not to be true, especially in the US and other European nations, excluding the racial antagonism we see in a lot of those places. You guys want to add on that, or you want me to keep going?
Yeah. Especially, I had something to say kind of about your about what you were saying about the end of history scenario, because it seems almost ironic to me that a lot of nationalists are opposed to multiculturalism and diversity and things like that, but in the same sense that we have we want immigrants just legally from the American conservatives, we have nationalists who say stuff like, oh, well, the true diversity is nationalism because we're diverse on the planet and everyone has their own nation. That's really another one of those ideal, never can work in reality scenarios that people like to use for rhetorical emphasis as, oh, we still want diversity, we just want it in our way. It's the same exact thing. It's, oh, we just want immigration, we just want it in our way. So that argument, I can't stand that argument because it's so short-sighted, and it plays by the same semantics that our adversaries play by. It still plays by those naturalistic semantics where diversity is a good thing, and
Diversity is our strength.
yeah. Diversity,
Air quote,
it's just
quote.
that would be emphasized on a scale that's the world scale. It would be like, oh, diversity is the strength of the world because everyone's a nationalist. It's the same exact idea, just on a different scale.
And then you get those distinct cultural or technological advancements because of people's unique isolation to these geographic regions, like we saw with post-Renaissance Europe. And then everything would happen all over again with vast inequalities between peoples. And yes, that would probably always be the case to some extent, but having that NatSoc or alt-right sort of wet dream would only repeat those histories that we've supposedly been learning from. And what Vincent was just saying isn't in any way an endorsement of multiculturalism either.
Yeah, definitely.
Saying that, like just let people into our borders or whatever. It's an argument on the Praxis idea of liberty, and we'd probably get more into that in a later episode definitively. But from our doctrine, I actually have a quote that is, the application of liberty to a collective with one ethic will impede on the liberty of those with opposing ethics within the same bound. This demonstrates the inoperability of multiculturalism with any notion of liberty, for to grant liberty universally on an individual level is to grant it to none. And that brings us to the nationalism discussion, with that if everyone has their sort of pockets of reality to this nationalism that is universally and unequivocally set in stone, then no one really has any freedom to define themselves as their own nation, because you'll eventually have internal struggles or disagreements with the people within your own borders. And that's what I wanted to get on with the racial nationalists, is that in places like the US or in Germany or in Russia or wherever, I just want to focus on like European modeled places, because that's where we get the most of these people. You have disagreements with your own folk, air quote to say, and you'll have people that share your same lineage, your same hair color, eye color, skin color, language, maybe even religion, and you'll have fundamental disagreements with them on a philosophical or spiritual or identity level. And those have persisted all throughout history, and how revolutions come about, how civil wars come about, how new nations spring up or new kingdoms develop. And that's because of our inherent bickering nature, even within our own people. Yes, we're more likely to get along with people of our in-group, but that doesn't get rid of the natural problems of society altogether. And you'll have, even in the modern context, very staunch, out-group-oriented liberal urbanites that like I said, may hold all of those same attributes with someone who is a very traditionalist, conservative countryman that lives out in the boons or some other sort of orientation entirely, and their two worldviews and lifestyles are almost incompatible with each other, even though they live in the same nation or they hold all these same attributes. And it's those different sets of lifestyles that kind of get this disconnect that we see in society all across the West.
Yeah, especially in things like communist revolutions that happen all throughout, Europe in the 20s and 30s, and even the sort of pseudo cultural revolutions that happened post 1960s in the West. These are very much exemplary of the type of thing that you're talking about. The everyone with the in-group is having a sort of different opinion from people within the in-group, and the Russian Civil War is probably one of the main examples of what you're talking about there, because you have it's the Russian in-group. There is no other group, but you have the staunch monarchists, and then you have the staunch revolutionaries who are not going to budge on either of their principles, but yet they are part of the same nation, or they, at the very least, they have the same genetic makeup and have the same traits. And the same thing with Italy in the 20s and Germany in the 20s. We had where you could see these various in-groups who all shared the same genetic makeup and all lived within the same national boundaries and all had the same histories and descended from the same people, having these wildly different ideals for the future of their nation, or even the definition of their nation. And it's astounding to see how different people's opinions can be, even in their own borders, when they share the same history and share the same makeup. But that's the problem with nationalism, is that they don't take these things into consideration, or if they do, they don't take them the full 9 yards. They don't understand them entirely. If a person of their race holds a different philosophy or values different principles, then they would say, oh, they're just misguided against their race. They just aren't in line with their heritage. And in a sense, I understand that, but on another level, you have to understand that what's going on now is a little bit more important than what happened back then, because the principles and the source of legitimacy, the eternal elements that are present throughout history and in the present and will be present in the future in the solid form or metaphysical form, these are the things that really matter and are the determination of the future of certain societies. So nationalists who put all their eggs in the basket of the nation are losing out on these other elements, especially, like I said earlier, especially when nationalism aligns itself with a sort of traditionalism, or what I would call a pseudo-tradition.
Like how could like a liberal and a communist or whatever be a countryman? How could that work at all? If they're already opposed to like the views of of their own culture or their own backgrounds, or whatever. Like, how could that work out at all?
Yeah, it's
like fight at all.
It's essentially the same type of aspect as the communistic view of class warfare being the most omnipresent warfare, but in a different sense. It's not actually like that.
It would almost come down to the literal racial application of the logical fallacy, no true Scotsman, where that's not a true German, that's not a true white in that scenario.
Yeah. Because nationalism is, like I said, it's an adopted pseudo-ideology. And I say pseudo-ideology because it's sort of baseless beyond the constant reiteration of my country is good in various ways. But anyways, nationalism is typically a pseudo-ideology that's adopted in reaction to the modern world and a universal globalist hegemony. But the problem is, it's only a surface-level solution to a much deeper problem. Nationalism is seen as the antithesis to the current globalistic hegemony because individual nation-states are, on the surface at least, the opposite of a globalistic order. But the problem is that well, number
Well,
one,
before you get any
nationalism.
further, I wanted to mention, going off what you've said already, is bringing up those third positionist movements from the 30s and 40s, which we've kind of alluded to already, and how their sort of nationalism was centered around that racialist perspective, but also this irredentist vision on which we're getting on now. And irredentism is a specific form of nationalism or application thereof that we want to get into, that generally starts going down the road that we try to get at towards Praxism, but fails under the weight of its own vision. Because a lot of it comes from hailing back to a vision of society that is more traditional in its path, but often only looks at a period of time that's temporal in nature and gets stuck there, instead of looking at what the principle of that time was and the stock of the people that inhabited that time. And so even with the American conservative or the racial nationalists or whoever, they look at points in time where things were going well, like in 1950s America, that the typical American conservative kind of hails back to as the heyday of the American dream, and the U.S. being on top of the world, riding that high of winning World War II and everything else about it. But what they miss is the spiritual essence of what was going on in the U.S. at the time, and the stock of the people still holding on to those traditional values that were bestowed upon them by their parents and grandparents, whom lived much more closely to antiquity than post-50s America ever would. And that's, we see that kind of, like I said, with the whole industrialization and industrial revolutions, like with the new space age technologies coming out at that time, which radically changed society. But in the 30s and 40s, in that sense, it was already happening to a degree because of this rapid globalization in other markets, because transportation was developing like crazy with planes, trains, and automobiles, and this reaction to that global liberalism that was coming out of the woodworks and these communist revolutions that were hailing to a globalist workers' revolt were infecting these once great, regal, and archaic nations like Germany and Italy and Spain and Japan. And so their reactions to that were reactionary in nature. And they held on partially to the physical location where they were and the borders of their nation, partially to the racial aspect of the people who made up those nations, and also partially to that period in time that that was their predecessor to that point where they made these movements and declared these wars. And they looked back on that time or on these lost lands from previous wars that they alluded to as being part of their people or part of the greater movement of who they were as a nation, and used that as a means of encouraging the people to move towards this idea of what nationalism was. And that kind of shot themselves in their foot, because it started all this conflict with other nations around them and accelerated the natural diffusion of things instead of letting it go towards the course of mental interplay.
Yeah, it stopped being natural after a certain point. It started being forced.
Yeah. Well, any war over territory like that then turns into an unnatural acceleration of that cultural diffusion. So these movements in the 30s and 40s were, I'd say, the most radical and possibly the most successful revolts against the increasing liberal order of the world. And their ultimate demise set forth the stage for the world governments that we see today, with the European Union and the United Nations and all these different trade alliances, with America on top as the big globo homo sort of exporter to the rest of the world. And it's sad to say, because many people look at those revolts against this liberal order as abhorrent, and they are dark because of the consequences that came out about them. And I think everyone knows what I'm implying there. But a excerpt from our doctrine again, from the Collective Conscience, and that excerpt I read before was from True Liberty.
I actually want to interrupt for just 1 second because I have something to add in on that before
Okay.
you. But I think that even though it was a revolt against the liberal emphasis of society, and it was a successful revolt, I don't think that we should group it in with a successful implementation of tradition and a proper conservative element.
I wasn't going to.
Yeah. It's just it is a successful revolution against liberalism. It doesn't mean that it's a proper successful implementation of certain traditionalistic ideals. It's a stepping stone. It's a path backwards, I would say.
Yeah, and that's what I was trying to imply with their latching on to the irredentism, the racialism, and the geographic locations, which we all kind of looked at already and kind of disassembled as being steps in the right direction, but lacking all the other aspects, if not physically, then metaphysically, in their application.
Yeah.
And any light reading of history of that time period shows you that those movements just lacked a spiritual component that would have tamed them a bit more and held them back a bit more.
Yeah, one of the comments
just hardcore, like we're going to war mentality.
Yeah, one of the comments I read on a post I saw regarding monarchism, and it was a sort of discussion post, and it was a question posed to monarchists, which was, why do they not support fascism, or what was their opinion of fascism? And one of the comments that was there was that they saw fascism as a very angry, or nationalism in general, they saw as very angry and very rage-driven, next to the propriety and piety of the noble court. So they saw this as this sort of profane expulsion of certain rage that is held up against the liberal order, but then the establishment of it kept that rage going and kept that sort of anger to it that didn't ever settle down. And then after the only time it did settle down was when it was killed by an external element. So I'm not sure we ever got to see the full results of what would have happened there, but I do think in principle it was a lot angrier and more rage-driven than monarchy or even tradition, because tradition has a sort of pious, truth-oriented character, whereas nationalism has a very nation-oriented, physical character.
Yes. And this quotation from the Collective Conscience points at the liberal governments not being the only alternative to the failed monarchies of the past. Leastways, it has no prevention for lack of connection between nation and citizen. In fact, it discourages it. And that's that reactionary nature of nationalism to the liberal orders post-monarchy, which all of this is just reactionary down the course of history post-Enlightenment. And those movements in the 30s and 40s kind of birthed the sort of nationalism we see today, as much as people might not want to hear that and say, oh, it's just like liberals calling us Nazis and stuff. No, that's not what's happening here, but you have to be honest with the context of history, in that those movements were the sorts of starting rebellions or revolts against the liberal order that was moving for already 200-300 years before then. And it is that angry reaction as like a natural defense mechanism psychologically to your homeland or to your shared people or identity or whatever. And it's almost like people acting overly defensively, even though no one's really attacking them. Although in the case of the 30s and 40s, there was a lot of internal attacks on those nations at the time.
Even today there is, but in a less drastic
well,
sense.
Today there is as well, but in a much more subversive sense, not necessarily in the overt nature that was happening in the 30s and 40s, in especially places like Germany. But that takes a much more specific scope of history that most people have ignored when they're learning about these periods in school. I would suggest always try and find books and written histories pre-1945. You get much less censorship and control of the narrative in written catalogs before then. Post-World War II, things get very muddled and New World Order controlled sort of dialogues. Just be mindful of that.
Yeah. I think it's also modern nationalism, especially in the American sense, still plays by that semantic battle between the left and the right, which is very hyper-focused and it doesn't take into account all of the other elements that make up certain ideologies. But to modern nationalists, especially of the American sort, and even especially of the civic nationalist Charlie Kirk sort, we have on the one hand we have communism, totalitarianism, things like that, and on the other hand we have liberal democracy, and that's the only alternative to the decadent principles of communism or the monarchic aristocratic order that preceded democracy, which can no longer be considered legitimate in any way. So we have this hyper-focus on liberalism, classical liberalism, which is now regarded as conservatism, which is adopted into nationalism, especially of the American sort, that now becomes weaponized against globalistic forces.
It's kind of sad because these rebrandings of what essentially was liberalism 20, 30 years in the past then confuses who would actually be like traditionalists, and maybe even leading down towards the path of Praxist. But this semantic sort of manipulation plays on to people clinging to words and phrases that they keep hearing repeated that are the closest representations of what they have in their own heads, but aren't the actualization of those true beliefs and thoughts. And oftentimes people are scared to express those because they're afraid of becoming condemned or canceled in modern society. And you see that especially with the CivNat types that see countries more as economic zones rather than legitimate nations all into their own that don't necessarily have to play by these global capitalistic enterprises that are even more subversive than a lot of the communistic revolutionaries and LARPers that they like to point at and decry. And it's quite ironic in a lot of senses that this happens and that this is branded as the new nationalism that people in the millions get behind, because it's a reset back down the road of liberalism, like I said, 20 or 30 years prior, that people are at least more comfortable with because it hasn't gotten as extreme in that point in time. And that's sort of that irredentism that we refer to as well, but in a wholly different sense, and in probably a much more subversive sense, because it primes whatever population to believe that the points on the same road that they're currently on just a few years before were wholly legitimate, and that just going back to those times would fix everything, but it would just
it's like the hourglass
slow
analogy.
down. Yeah, it would just slow down the progressive agenda on the sort of normal or natural-born conclusions of liberalism.
Yeah, that sort of brings me to what I would call the hourglass analogy, which I kind of want to give just a brief introduction to it. I think I mentioned it on the first episode, but the hourglass analogy is essentially what I would use to describe the difference in semantics between different societies. And essentially, on the one hand, you have traditional semantics, from which everything participates in a divine order. Everything is ordained by divinity, and everything participates in a sort of spiritualistic and transcendental nature. And there has to be an alignment between certain physical conceptions and metaphysical principles for this transcendence to take place. And all of this is manifested in things like caste and ambition and regality and things like that, which play a huge role in social organization. And then anti-traditional semantics would be physically oriented or physically based. Everything has a purpose that is material in nature, and everything is oriented back down onto the individual in the inferior sense, and oriented into entertainment or pleasure or freedom without responsibility, things like that. So that's in essence the two different semantics. And so traditional societies had semantics that were based on traditional semantics. They had societies that had a divine orientation. They had caste, regality, all of this sort of stuff, monarchy, divinity. They had proper religious practice and things like that. The hourglass, the base of the hourglass, was the traditional semantic side. So the hourglass analogy I would use to describe this situation that we have by having flipped the hourglass now over to the anti-traditional side, where now everything is oriented towards the physical and material result that it produces. And the sand in the middle of the hourglass would be the substance of the nation, or at least the substance of the nation's formal traditions. And over time, this sand trickles down now from the traditional side to the anti-traditional side. And I think during the Enlightenment, most of the sand was still in the top half. It was still in the sector for the traditional side, even though the hourglass had been flipped. But now we're seeing the sand slowly and slowly accumulate and pile on to the bottom of the anti-traditional side of semantics, where now everything is now being a representation of these semantics. But the problem is, conservatives are being almost misled into believing that putting the sand back into the top half is enough. And I don't think this comes from a certain excuse me. I don't think this comes from a certain desire to still have these same semantics. I think it's because they don't know any other semantics. They don't know how to fight the battle of they don't know how to fight the semantic battle. They don't know how to fight the definitions of words or the definitions of good and evil, because it's been spelled out for them their entire lives through institutionalized education and even through decadent forms of what used to be traditional religion. So there's a lot of...
Or to interject, it's even in the very label of conservative themselves, because you have to ask, what are you conserving?
Yeah.
Is it the spineless lack of moral society that liberalism has kind of developed into from all the different tools and functions that it's cropped around itself to perpetuate? And is that the thing that you're conserving or trying to preserve? Or is it some other concept that you don't really have a description or a name for that you want to conserve, but you're being played as a fool for conserving what was liberalism 20 or 30 years ago again, and just having those cycles repeat themselves and putting sand from the bottom back into the top of the hourglass.
Yeah, that's why I consider myself a Praxist or a traditionalist. I would never consider myself a conservative, because conservative is a very relative term that's been weaponized against what would be true conservatism or traditionalism, conservative of a traditionalistic order. But anyways, I say all that because I'm on the Wikipedia right now for what would be new nationalism, because I know that a lot of nationalists like Teddy Roosevelt, especially of the American sort, but the sort of policies here that are expressed under new nationalism is very antithetical to the ones that even modern nationalists would support. For example, we have in the electoral reform, we have women's suffrage, the direct election of senators, which improved, or I would say progressed the democracy in Republican democracy. And so there were a lot of progressive elements that were introduced into the Constitution and to the political discourse through Teddy Roosevelt's new nationalism. For example, a constitutional amendment to allow a federal income tax was proposed. Just small things like that, which now modern nationalists would abhor, is at the very basis of nationalism in America. And if we go back even further, we could go and see that, number one, nationalism wasn't even introduced into the discourse until about the 19th century. But even when it was introduced as a push for popular sovereignty, which was culminated with the ethnic and national revolutions of Europe. We have these Napoleonic Wars that went on that introduced these various elements of nationalism, which took the individual and made him a part of the national collective and stripped him of all his individual worth. And when I say individualism, I mean in the bad sense, because as Evola puts it, we're dealing with the individual as an abstract, atomistic, and statistical unity, not as a person, because the quality of a person, that is a being that has a specific dignity, a unique quality, and differentiated traits, is obviously negated and offended in a system which one vote is the equal of any other, in which the vote of a great thinker, a prince of the church, an eminent jurist or sociologist, the commander of an army, and so on, has the same weight, measured by counting votes, as the vote of an illiterate butcher's boy, a half-wit, or the ordinary man in the street who allows himself to be influenced in public meetings or who votes for whoever pays him. This is the type of stuff that nationalism espouses. These are the principles behind nationalism and the push for these progressive, anti-aristocratic and anti-traditional semantics that are now masked and being pushed and packaged as traditionalism, but are just really earlier stages within the same path that we've already taken.
Yeah. Kennedy, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I want to clarify on that note Vincent laid out, where the individual is now viewed as like a number on a ballot, on a paper, on data. But, as opposed to then, in his community back then, before nationalism became a thing, he was, his work, if he was like a local, blacksmith or something, his work was more valued and his labor was more valued. And so was his, individual personality and his, passions and all that. As opposed to today, where his work is just, another, mass-produced, chair or something. But it was,
yeah,
he was very more, important.
Definite irony of individualism is that it turns many individual people into statistical spreadsheets that compare individuals to each other and atomizes them completely without having any root to the society that they work under. And you see that now with people being as lonely and as neurotic as ever, even in our massively connected cybernetic lifestyles of today. And it's quite frustrating to see many people not understanding where that lacking is coming from.
Yeah, I think that there's two different sorts of individualism that we can go on, because there's the subpersonal individualism that nationalism espouses, and then there's the superpersonal individualism that is the proper form, where everyone has an aspiratory nature, where they aspire to fulfill whatever archetype it is that they have dormant within them, that spiritual ordainment of caste. Because nationalism simplifies the individuality of a person into the collectivity of the nation, not understanding that the collective of the nation is made up of groups of diverse functions. Like even when I was reading that section on Evola, he speaks of castes as different functional groups within a singular nation that would have an easier time understanding a group of that same function in a different nation than they would a group of another function in their same nation. And this is part of that hierarchical differentiation and hierarchical participation that he wrote in there. This is where you have that spiritual identity really take precedence over the physical or territorial identity, because, castes were traditionally understood as that suprapersonal, spiritual, or metaphysical preordainment, which was a requirement to be fulfilled by the individual in order for, the proper alignment of principles to occur. When most people up to the scientific age considered to be the true purpose of existence, this whole transcendence, this whole alignment of principles, this whole spiritual identity, that was what was the point of reference. But I bring that up because that spiritual identity, the fulfillment of the purpose of the caste, almost superseded the territorial factor of identity that most would use to define nation today. But it really boils down to the individual purpose within a given group. It boils down to that suprapersonal or that proper individualism rather than a profane.
That's what I wanted to get into next.
Yeah.
And that brings up one of the posts that we've had on Gab, where we were discussing the success brought about by a unifying superpersonal cause that you saw in those movements of the 30s and 40s as the third positionists were trying to formulate, but failed because of the lack of
substance,
spiritual substance and legitimacy that they were trying to bring about, and that they were getting caught up purely in the material realm. Whereas you see movements in like the United States Revolutionary War, or more currently with the Taliban in beating out the Americans from Afghanistan. And both of those conflicts were mostly won on the spiritual ascension and cohesion of those peoples against a wholly material empire. And in both senses, it was backwoods farmers fighting the most powerful empires of their times and winning somewhat off the back of help that they received from nations who are adversarial to those empires, but also on the spiritual nature on which those people were governed, giving them the will and the grit to fight and keep that fight justified and down to earth in an upward oriented sense. And that's what I wanted to get to next, where we keep alluding to this spiritual essence of nationalism that, the spiritual essence of a nation that truly solidifies it as a nation, that nationalism as an ideology often forgets, and why it fails and ends up corrupting the nation itself, ironically enough. And you see that post-revolution in the United States with the election of the Roman Catholic Bishop John Carroll in 1785, where it was the idea of latitudinarianism under the founding fathers' idea of freedom of association and freedom of religion, where it was meant to be freedom under the fact that people could associate with whatever denomination of Christianity that they wanted to worship under. And that's how the nation was founded, to be spiritually a Christian nation, and really not to be thought of as anything else, because the founding fathers had a very specific idea in mind that the government that they were forming was only to be able to be governed by and for a moral nation under that guise of Christianity. But they saw a sort of brotherhood or fraternity in all denominations and sects of Christianity, and that's why they were welcoming of a Catholic bishop to reign over the starting of the church in America, where otherwise the English rule under the colonies was hostile towards. And it was that ability to be able to work with other Christians that set them apart and set them above much of the world at that time and led to their success down the road. Ironically, also their failures once that American empire post-Civil War started.
One of the things that I think is kind of ironic is that just going off of what you were saying, we can get back to that subject, but the American empire is kind of the arch enemy of the American nation that originated there. And part of that, I think, is because the principles of Americanism are different than the principles of the founding stock, which was in America, which were the early Americans. Because, I would define a nation as being the result of both its formative principles and the formal traditions of a certain nation or a certain group. So, like I said earlier, it's the integration of the profane collective with the divine state. That's a proper nation, at least. But at the very least, a nation needs to have adherence to its formative principles, which for America, there are things like, equality and freedom and limited government and secularism and things like that. But the original stock, the founding stock of America, the Anglo-Saxon Protestants, who were very religiously oriented, these people had this identity of Anglo-Saxon Protestant as their primary identity and applied that to Americanism. So all of these American principles, the essence of the American nation, existed secondary to the primary source of identity for this group. So everything was hierarchically organized within that context. We had liberty, but under these pretenses, and we had equality, but under these pretenses. But now that stock is gone. So what we're left with is the essence of the nation, which as time goes on, you see this shift that goes from a hierarchically organized and divinely oriented society into a manifestation of more or less arbitrary ideals that are oriented onto freeing the individual from the largest amount of responsibility that they can be freed from.
Yeah, and that's one of the biggest critiques that Praxism has towards the liberal ordeal, is that freedom is held at its core, and the implications of freedom is that you're being freed from some sort of oppression, whereas the oppression might just be moral order, and that's no oppression at all. That's the necessary restraint that a civil society or even an individual civil man must uphold. Otherwise, you get brought down into chaos and disorder and a downwards orientation that ultimately sends yourself and your contemporaries into the dirt. I also wanted to bring up after that, though, that sort of superpersonal responsibility also kind of correlates with spiritual organizations themselves. And that pairing between the founding fathers and this Catholic bishop also shows the versatility and rigor of the Catholic Church itself as an institution, which we hold in somewhat high regard because of their ability to adapt to all these changing circumstances while still sticking to their moral order and genuine tradition that's been passed down through millennia, and that's survived entire empires and been able to withstand the fall of the civilizations that it kind of arose up with. And now it's still a global organization that has a founded hierarchical order with a genuine moral body that people can abide by, and it's its legitimacy still reigning from above in a space outside of man's corruption, which is that sort of divine dictation through God and Jesus and the Bible, therefore. And so it's that point of admiration for institutions like that are able to withstand all that, despite all the controversies they may have. Those almost all arise from individuals within the church that don't abide by its tenets and end up corrupting individual offices, not necessarily the whole structure of the church itself, which exists outside of any physical location or priestly order.
Yeah, that's one thing that modern nationalists I don't think get, because the source of legitimacy for, the source of legitimacy within nationalism is the physical notion of the nation, which, due to it not being ideologically united and due to there being other nations beside it, this is inherently subjective. Modern nationalism uses the nation, usually in the physical, ethno-linguistic, or territorial sense, to legitimize all the other internal aspects and conceptions within that nation. And it goes even so far as to determining, what person is legitimate only by virtue of something as circumstantial as, place or time of someone's birth. So definitely it takes precedence over the divine institutions like you were talking about.
Or the divine institutions take precedence over it.
No, I'm saying within conceptions of nationalism, it takes precedence over divine institutions.
Yeah, and how if you're a nationalist, like how I don't really get like how can your country basically be legitimized or anything at all if you basically completely rely on popular support and the popular sway of the motions of the massive population that's already divided by ideology and religion.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's often the failure of nationalists and a nationalism centered ideology when confronted with the ebb and flow of time and change of cultural diffusion and the drawing of borders, because it often sets that, like you said before, that end of history scenario where people want to be pocketed in these nations as they are and conserve space totally how it is in this moment without any change being brought forth, when over the course of history nations survived the concession of land or subgroups of people by being able to protect the core spirit and essence of the nation that goes beyond just a singular region or people themselves, even though that sounds kind of contradictory to what we were saying. But looking at it like the formulation of the French nation all the way back in, I think, the 10th century, that was a whole bunch of different kingdoms that got together and were unified with somewhat similar language, somewhat similar customs, but still wholly unique on their own, that did speak differently, that did have different customs, that did have different kings and principalities, but saw the external forces playing against them and thought it wiser to formulate an actual nation that spanned a much larger geographical area where they could defend the essence of their unified identity in giving up certain regions at certain times and then maybe regaining them in the future as that ebb and flow of history sort of commands. And you saw that with the different wars between France and England, or between the Moorish invasion from Northern Africa, or any number of different conflicts and invasions throughout history, that French nation still withstands today and is largely still the same stock of people with the same values and language and traditions, only very recently being threatened by this globo homo enterprise of liberalism that, ironically enough, was a descendant of the French Revolution and its consequences. But still, France is one of those places that, as much of a paradox as it is for its political history, withholds that true essence of a nation because of its strong identity and spiritual cohesion.
Yeah, that kind of brings me to, that kind of brings me to the Holy Alliance. If some people don't know what the Holy Alliance is, it's essentially the coalition of certain nations. I believe it was Germany, or I believe it was Prussia at the time, but Prussia, Hungary, and
Austria.
Russia, I believe.
No, Austria.
Austria, Austria. And essentially what it was a coalition of these three nations, which was with the main goal, with the intent to stop the tide of liberalism and of even nationalism that's going through Europe at the time by the result of all those Napoleonic wars. But the reason I bring that up is because a little bit on in that chapter of nationalism and collectivism, Evola mentions the Holy Alliance, and he talks about how, from liberalism resulted democracy, and that would pave the way for socialism, which would pave the way for radicalism and communism. Essentially, he was saying that the entire revolution of the entire French Revolution resulted in this world revolution that was essentially flipping the hourglass the entire way. The Enlightenment was part of that, but then the French Revolution was sort of the final blow, the nail in the casket,
powder keg, sort of.
That what flipped that hourglass. But he at the end of this paragraph, he says that this is why Metternich, who was one of the main proponents of the Holy Alliance, saw folly in coming to terms with subversion. If you give it a hand, it will soon take the arm and the rest of the body as well. Having understood the revolutionary phenomenon and its unity and essence, Metternich indicated the only possible antidote, a similar supranational front of all the traditional states and establishments of a defensive and offensive league of all the monarchs of divine right. This was what the Holy Alliance was meant to be. And this is kind of what I think nationalists are sort of bogged down by, is their inability to unite, that sort of inability to recognize that the fight that we're in right now is not a fight of nationalism versus globalism. It's of universalism of one sort versus universalism of another sort. And one of these universalisms, which is the liberal, egalitarian, the anti-traditional semantics, this is versus another sort of universalism, which is of a traditional sort, except the anti-traditional one manifests in globalism. It manifests in that physical universalism that you can see today, where everyone is sort of egalitarian and equal and everything like that. Whereas the proper universalism is resulted in hierarchies and differentiation between different peoples. So the universalism that nationalism opposes needs to be fought with a proper traditionally oriented and divine universalism of a different sort, but it's largely overlooked because people are afraid of the word universalism, and they're afraid of the word ecumenical, and they're afraid of actually binding and cohering with people outside of their nation. But the fight is against people outside of their nation, and the fight is with comrades who are outside of their nation, or what would be identified as their nation by virtue of being not the same race or outside of the same borders. But you can see this sort of conservative coalition that's popped up. I say conservative in the traditionalistic sense, or like at least in the anti-liberal sense, but you can see this coalition that's popped up all over the world. You have people who are like Ma-based Poland and Ma-based Hungary and Ma-based China and Ma-based Taliban, and you can see this sort of theme that's going along. I think people are catching on now that there does need to be a universal fight against global homo, but I don't think they're fully there yet. They're still battling about nationalism, and that's what I think the main fault of the third position is, and even of the reactionaries and modern conservatives like Charlie Kirk.
So, anything else to add, gentlemen? I think that about covers it.
I mean, I kind of wanted to get into irredentism a little bit because
Oh, I
nationalism.
thought we did speak about that at length.
Oh, well, I kind of wanted to add that I think there's a big link between modern nationalism and irredentism. And I think that's a trait that originated from the development of nationalistic principles in the 20th century, which developed kind of from Enlightenment liberal ones to collectivistic authoritarian ones. Because in that time,
Yeah, we
you can
did
see
mention that already.
Yeah. I'm just sort of reiterating the points that I made.
Okay.
But in that time, you could see kind of that, nationalism sort of evolved or whatever because of its it had defeated its enemy. It defeated the old guard. It defeated the aristocracy and everything. So what it did was it took on a sort of reactionary character because it accomplished its goal. It defeated its enemy. So now it had a new enemy, which was liberalism. So I think that the reason that a lot of nationalists adhere to irredentism is because there is no other weapon in the arsenal. But you can see this with different variations of nationalistic tropes that popped up throughout Europe. You can see that Mussolini wanted to revive Rome, for example, and you can see that Hitler wanted to unify all of the Germanic peoples into one Germanic people or one Germanic tribe based on certain traditions.
Volk.
Yeah, the Volk. But the problem, I think, is that a lot of these tropes, you can look back at history and you can see these different tropes. The proper manifestation of these tropes, I should say, are within history that are now trying to be revived and brought back. And so the problem, I would think, with irredentism is that the principles are lost in the form. There's a saying where form follows function, and I think that Praxism really adheres to that by not being irredentist and not being nationalist and really basing itself in metaphysical principles. But things like fascism and National Socialism and a general nationalism took on an irredentist character and now are basing themselves almost as if function follows form, where they want to revive certain traditions, but they don't know why. Like for example, they speak of tradition and they sort of justify tradition by saying it's a quote unquote healthy lifestyle, but the healthy results of tradition are more of a secondary effect of certain metaphysical elements that make up a nation.
Yeah, and on that note, I'd like to add that even though we oppose, like irredentism and nationalism, we still don't directly oppose the establishment and the maintaining of empires and all like these states that want more territory or whatever. Because even though they want more territory, as long as they follow the basic Praxist philosophy, then they should still be Praxist and not just based with nationalist and all that, without any tradition or anything.
Yeah,
Like we said, it was that natural diffusion of nations amongst each other without the overt conflict for a time or a romanticization that can't ever actually exist in reality or can't be revived again because those circumstances don't exist anymore.
Yeah. I think what we're seeing now is a nationalism that is originated or sourced in anti-traditional principles while playing on the aesthetics of historic empires and peoples, which can only be expressed through certain traditions and the survival of ideals, if maintained properly. But I think...
Yeah, I think that's a good note to end on, though.
Cody, I think you have one more thing you wanted to add.
It's more just a reiteration of the challenge and the question we posed to everybody when we started this is for all those that call themselves nationalists or even conservatives, like we said, in liberal states, how do you reconcile the complete isolation of our citizenry from the state and the collective's disunification in what was once a nation? Because we see that erosion of what we defined as nations previously by these subversive forces of both nationalism, globalism, liberalism. Is your nationalism, how you define it, just state worship, or is it a romanticization of a people unified under vanity and aesthetic? Is it a preservation of a chronos under a liberalism you find less repulsive, but is still liberalism nonetheless? What does nationalism mean to you really? Or is it just a buzzword that you keep repeating because it's the only chant you know of that comes close to the desires of your spirit and conscience? After listening to what we discussed, I want everyone to deeply think about that as reflecting on the challenges in different contexts we brought up throughout this entire podcast. And I hope you maybe come to the realization of what we were trying to espouse this whole time on our critiques of nationalism, but not the essence of nations themselves, and a lot of these surrounding ideologies like the civic nationalists and the racial nationalists that corrode those ideas even more.
Yeah,
I
those
think that's a good
are. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was saying that's a good note to end off on. You can go ahead.
Oh, all right. Yeah, no, those are very good questions, indeed. And we would love to listen and hear any responses that you guys might have in our comment section. I think that would be very interesting to read through. But with that, I hope everyone enjoyed listening into today's podcast. Make sure you check out our link tree in the description down below, where you can find our BitChute and all of our alternative socials. Thank you so much to our founder, Vincent.
Yeah, no problem.
And our leadership council members, Kennedy and Cody.
Welcome.
Absolutely.
This is Meloria, and we hope to see you all back here next time at the Praxis Table Talks.
Have a good one, everyone.